So let's continue in our talk today. Now, the topic that has been given to me is G20 leadership future prospects for India. Now, this is such a fabulous topic. And why I say it is fabulous is because once you understand what is G20 and you look at its history, and then all you have to do is remind yourself about India's history. And then you realize this presidency should not just come to us for a year, it actually belongs to us on a permanent basis. Because we have done so much for the globe, unrecognized, unsung heroes of the planet. And why I say all this, I'm going to share this with you as we proceed and go ahead in our talk. So my talk is going to be, and not using any PowerPoint, in the following. I'm going to first tell you, because these are students of open learning, I'm going to spend some time and give you an introduction of what G20 is, what it means, and where does it, what is the context, and where does it position India when we say that India has gained its presidency for the year. Then I'm going to talk about a few initiatives that G20 wants to undertake. And then I'm going to talk about India and India's position as far as G20 is concerned. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to look at the begin with, to look at what is G20. As you know, the globe is passing through a very difficult time. It's a difficult time not only in terms of finances, it's also a very difficult time in terms of climate. And this sort of a climate change has not happened in thousands of years. Actually, nobody knows that the planet is warming at such a rapid rate that the glaciers are melting and water levels would rise so that many towns on the ocean front could just get sunk. This sort of a climate change was not heard of, and therefore nobody thought that this sort of a thing can ever happen. So on one hand, the world has moved from financial crisis regularly, and the latest one, as you know, happened, of course, not the Great Depression of 1930s, but the global financial recession that has happened starting from Lehman Brothers in 2008. There's been no turning back. There's been trouble after trouble. Series of issues have happened since then. So the world, we need to sit together and talk about it. As far as the climate change is concerned, we all know, and I'll just give you a bird's eye view of where the world would be lining up. There are issues of green development, which means that the development model which we have seen in the last 200 odd years is probably not the correct development model. There is probably an alternate development model. And that alternate development model actually lies in India. Because for thousands of years, and it's been documented by various scholars, for thousands of years, India was the richest country on the planet. And when we say India was the richest country on the planet, it just wasn't just one of the richest. It was the most richest. Today, America accounts for about 20% of world GDP. For 1000 years, India accounted for about 33% of world GDP. So you can imagine the might, the respect and credibility India had, and the policies that India pursued were sustainable, that for thousands of years we were continuing to be the richest. For 2000 odd years, India continued to account for more than 20% of GDP and less than 33%. We were still the richest. It's just because we were the richest for such a long time that everybody in the world would envy us, come looking for us, come looking for our growth model, and so came the people who would plunder us. And so, unfortunately, came the people like from Britain and other European areas to colonize us. And during this process of plundering, foreign rule, and colonial rule, India suffered the worst fate. Our resources were depleted, Literacy, our local literacy levels were challenged, undermined, ridiculed, and a foreign education system imposed upon us, and our richnesses were reduced to poverty. So much so, after about 800, 1100 years of foreign rule in one form or the other, the literacy level in India was just around 10%, and poverty level in India was about 90% in 1947. So much for being the richest country on the planet. So the growth models which are now being discussed are being considered in terms of what to do with climate. Are there alternate growth models? Can green development take place? And should we have sustainable development goals? Should we have inclusive and resilient growth? How can we have lifestyle for environment growth? Can we follow a lifestyle which ensures sustainable and environmental friendly growth? These issues are being discussed. Now, when the presidency has come to India, India has given one slogan which is known to all of us in our country. And because we have a common thread, and because Sanskrit is the common language amongst us for most of the Indian languages today, the objective, the motto that we have offered to the world is a very simple one, very understandable, and extremely emotional. We just have one earth, no alternative. On this earth, we have now realized we are one family. Whatever you do in the Western world impacts the emerging countries, and whatever you do in the emerging countries, sooner or later, impacts the Western world. If there is a severe carbon footprint in any part of the world, on any area in the planet, the whole planet suffers. You can use coal in one corner of the planet, but the whole planet will suffer. You can use fossil oil, and so would the same thing happen. The world realized there is just one earth. You can use its resources the way you want. And we are just one family, which means we survive, we live, we thrive, we sink, we do anything, we do it together. That means our future is linked. Now that means lots of responsibility on each one of us. No country now can escape accountability and responsibility. That means in the last 300 years, since the Industrial Revolution, somebody has not taken their responsibility properly. I often say people who become rich very fast cannot cope with richness. Same is true for advanced countries. They became very fast with the Industrial Revolution. They did not have the resources of their own. They plundered and took it from their colonies, cheated them, and then became rich in a very short time. It was not organic hard work, not organic growth, but it was by deception and cheating, and therefore their growth was artificial. They did not know how to live with the richness. They exploited everything that came their way. Extremely greedy, chasing materialistic things. In the name of patents, they were innovative, but those innovations were not time tested. Consequently, the world has reached a situation of fate which is very dreaded and very scary. In contrast, the India growth model is extremely sustainable. If you can sustain a growth model, grow from riches to riches for thousands of years, unlike the Western model, which only allowed you to grow at a peak in 300 years but brought the world to a brink of a crash. Unlike this Western model, India's growth model was far more sustainable. The growth model of India was very simple. It believed in the simple concept that earth has to be respected like your mother. The water had to be respected like your father. The air had to be respected like your teacher. Very simple formula. The basic elements on which the whole planet survives, the basic elements were full of respect. Air, water, and earth, you couldn't live without it. As you can't live without your father, you can't come on this planet without your father or mother, and you cannot thrive and blossom without the teacher. So was the status given to these elements. And then, not only that, once these respectful attitude towards the elements was mentioned, anything that got created was equally respected. The plants, the trees, they were worshipped. Green belt, and each tree had its value. And it was determined even before botanical sciences developed, before microscopes came into existence, before sophisticated instruments to measure whether plants can breathe ever were thought. The Indian philosophers and experts had already discovered which plant releases what type of oxygen and other gases. Even before chemistry had started finding place, Indians knew that the neem tree can give oxygen day and night. The peepal tree had its own value. The tulsi plant had its own value. The guava leaves can take care of your dental problems. Where did this research come from? The Ayurveda. And where does the Ayurveda, how much time do you date it back? Thousands of years. So anything that got created from three elements were respected and worshipped. When it came to the birds and the animals, again, the same concept of live and let live, and not just live and let live, live respectfully and allow others to live respectfully. So much so that birds were considered the vehicles of God. Many animals, some ferocious, were also considered as vehicles of God. So much so that the cow was respected as a mother because cow milk could sustain the child, and cow products were part of your basic meal and food cycle. So the elements are respected, the plants are respected, the flora fauna are respected, and so coexistence happens. And therefore, when you grow, the growth model that you have in mind is sustainable. You don't want to cut trees and make forests vanish. No, you don't want to pollute air or water. All your patents are respectful to the nature and the environment in which you live. The patents have been tested. They are not there to exploit one element against the other. One family did not say the Homo sapiens are the best and that the cow and the animals and the flowers are not. The Homo sapiens will coexist with the plants and animals. And that is why, in the alternate growth model that India experimented with, the average span of life was easily 100 years and more. The best countries in the world, we speak of the best modern sciences and medical health, still average around 85 years of lifespan. India, on an average, was more than 100. That means it was a sustainable model for the environment, it was a sustainable model for the individual. Coexistence was what was taught, and coexistence meant the concept of family was not restricted to me and my brothers, sisters, father, and mother. It was not just restricted to Homo sapiens, it was one planet, one family. That lesson, that understanding of not to exploit, was there in the Indian traditional wisdom. Each one was respected, and each one was regarded as useful for the other. You hurt one, you hurt the others. You respect one, you respect the whole. This is not the Western model of growth. So, by about late last century, the world realized that there is a big problem that is happening, and one needs to revisit as to what is going on. So, the G20 was founded in 1999, and the members of the G20 are basically advanced countries of the world and a few emerging countries, and of course, the European Union. These countries put together, they are both industrialized and developed countries mostly, and few developing countries, and they account for 80% of the world output. They account for 75% of international trade, two-thirds of the global population, and 60% of the world land area. So that means it's a very influential chunk of policymakers. Therefore, it also implies that G20 can drive the agenda of the planet. Because herein, the leaders of these countries will put their head together, think together, plan together, at least flag the issues together, at least make people learn concerns of the world will be brought on the table, and therefore some remedies, some solutions will be thought together. So this consists of high-ranking officials. The top officials of the country are always there, which includes the Prime Minister or the President of the country, the finance ministers of the country, the governors of the countries. And basically, the finance ministers and the governors closely interact throughout the year and discuss various issues that keep coming up at these interactions. Earlier, they were not meeting regularly. But then, over the years, it became important that these countries, the G20, they should start moving on an annual basis, discuss issues, think about the solutions, and start working on an annual basis. So, from 2006 onwards, many meetings have taken place, and every time the themes would be different. The theme of the 2006 G20 meeting was building and sustaining prosperity. So the issues discussed during that time was how to achieve sustainable growth. And this is 2006. What about global energy and resource commodity prices and markets? And then reforms of the most important multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, 2006. And the world had then started thinking about the demographic changes that are taking place in the world. In 2007, South Africa, they were hosting the G20. In 2008, Brazil, and this is very interesting how the history has developed over the years. In 2008, the Brazil's Minister of Finance proposed dialogue on competition in financial markets, clean energy, economic development, and fiscal elements of growth and development. So you can see these issues are coming over and over again. In 2008 happened the Lehman Brothers. The global financial crisis starts. In the meeting of the G7 finance ministers, which is the top most developed countries, with no developing country as a member there, President Bush already mentioned that there is a need to finding solutions to the economic crisis of 2008. Now, this is where I think the world has to think with hindsight. The subprime crisis that precipitated in the Lehman Brothers in 2008, the subprime crisis had started in a way earlier. And why the Wall Street and why the financial experts, the policymakers, the watchdogs, the market regulators turned a blind eye to the derivative products. We all know about the mortgage-backed securities, the asset-backed securities, mainly in the housing sector, and loans being given to people who did not have a regular income stream or loans being given more than their capacity. We all know. And it was obvious it will precipitate one day. And it did. Countries like India, far more responsible, conservative in their approach, but visionaries, did not implement or adopt these fancy, fashionable, difficult to understand, exotic instruments like these mortgage backed securities. They withstood the pressure, they withstood the sustained pressure, saying these are modern, well developed, highly collateralized, dynamic financial instruments. No, India said no, we will not accept these. The credit, of course, goes to the then governors, both Bimal Jalan and Dr. Y.V. Reddy. So the journey keeps moving, the of the G20, and various issues keep coming up in various annual meetings. The summits were also held in 2016 in China, in 2017 in Germany, in 2018 in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and the 2019 in Japan. The 2020 summit was scheduled in Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, but because there was a COVID time, it was virtually held. The 21 summit was in Rome, Italy, and the 2022 summit was in Indonesia, Bali. By that time, I'm sure we all Indians knew that G20 is happening and next year we are in the presidency. The presidency moves in terms of a troika, the immediate past, the current, and the future. So this year, when we are in the presidency, the troika consists of Indonesia, the immediate past president, India, the current president, and Brazil, the next one. It will move on to Brazil next year. India will be part of the troika, India, Brazil, and South Africa. And then it will move on to South Africa and Brazil, South Africa, and the next country. The point I am making is that we, at this point of time, are very lucky that we have Indonesia, India, and Brazil as 3 consecutive years of the presidency. That means the emerging markets are at the helm of affairs in providing inputs, discussing issues, flagging the issues in the international market. So, when we talk about the G20, it has various implications and it has various impact. Tourism, of course, is one important thing that benefits from G20 meetings. It is in 2014 a very interesting episode, something similar to what is happening now. The Australian foreign minister had proposed, and it was in Brisbane, to ban Russia from the summit over its annexation of Ukrainian Crimea. And then the democratic values in G20 prevailed, and they said, no, this cannot happen. The G20 belongs to all of us, and one single country cannot determine its nature and its character. So, therefore, the agenda of the G20 is reasonably universal in nature. Everybody knows about it, and also generally it is applicable where every country feels the ownership of it. For example, in 2016, the G20 framed its commitment to the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development Goals in 3 themes: the promotion of strong, sustainable, and balanced growth, protection of the planet from degradation, and this is 2016, and furthering cooperation with low income and developing countries. Now, this is where, and that is the reason I'm flagging it, this is where I would ask you for your attention. Now, the thought of seeking cooperation from low income and developing countries is coming in a big way. Whereas this should have come much earlier when United Nations was formed in 1945-46. Going on further, Indonesia last year focused on the global COVID-19 pandemic and how to collectively overcome the challenge that COVID posed. The 3 priorities of Indonesia's presidency were global health, the overall global health architecture, digital transformation, and sustainable energy transitions. It is in this background that India assumes, in the historical context as well as the development that has happened, and what I've given you is a bird's eye view of the G20, that India assumes the presidency of this important virtual think tank. And in this important virtual think tank, once again, we reminded the world that we are just having one earth and there's no alternative. We are one family. Something happens, we all suffer together. Now, when in 2016, one has already said we need cooperation from the least developed and developing countries. So we are one now. And now we share same future. As an economist, for a long time, we used to think that we can decouple from the rest of the world. If we do not trade much with them, if our imports are not much and we don't get things from them, our exports are not much, the world is not dependent on us. Neither are we dependent on the world in ensuring export markets exist and therefore production in my country happens. We can decouple. But none of us, none of the economists thought, and none of the scholars, philosophers, scientists thought that it will be the climate which will drive the world in understanding that we are one family and that the future of our existence, that the future of our children, and the future of commodities and plants and animals before we become extinct belongs on our common interaction. So therefore, it is on our shoulders, India's shoulder, when the time has come to showcase to the world that how India, over these last so many years and for thousands of years, we were taking care of the whole planet, the whole ecosystem, the flora and fauna, the basic elements that I narrated to you right in the beginning. The issue is very clear. The world is one, the future is common, and that's not related just through finance or through economics. It is also related through geopolitics. It's also related through the common ideologies that we follow in one country versus the other country. It also relates to accepting differences of opinion and coexisting, something that the democratic values of India have demonstrated over thousands of years. Today is the day when the whole country is celebrating Subhash Chandra Bose. If you look at the history of Subhash Chandra Bose and India's freedom movement, on one hand you have Indian National Congress, which believes and says peaceful agitation. On the other hand, you have Subhash Chandra Bose, who believes as a revolutionary, taking up the arms, organizing military, and if need be, taking military action. He mobilizes forces, he sets up Indian National Army, and very modern in his concept, he has the women's wing too, and he says, if you do not understand logic, we can uproot the British rule. India, I think, will have to recognize the role of the revolutionaries in the freedom struggle. On one hand, the Indian National Congress led by Mahatma Gandhi and supported by Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel and the leaders that we are familiar with, is pushing India's independence. On the other hand, are the revolutionaries like Bhagat Singh, like Subhash Chandra Bose, who are ready to take up arms. Please remember, India, with its philosophy of tolerance, respect for others, also had Subhash Chandra Bose as president of Indian National Congress. And I think the freedom struggle of India will have to be rewritten, taking into account the role of such revolutionaries. But the point that I'm making here is the richness of India's philosophy, the richness of India's attitude towards tolerating another viewpoint, and how that compels the forces, they be in power or you call them the enemy forces, to recognize the strength of the country. I'm of the firm belief that if history is revisited, the role of Subhash Chandra Bose, the day we are celebrating today, will be highlighted in a more appropriate manner and not just thought as a sideshow. But that is India's richness. We have a common objective of attaining independence. There is various ways through which we will attain it. There can be peaceful agitation of Mahatma Gandhi. There can be Indian National Army of Subhash Chandra Bose. And people will respect and support both. And that is how we got our independence. My own view, of course, is there is an economic theory of India's independence which has yet not been properly investigated. And if I get time, I propose to do that. And my economic theory of India's economic independence, India's political independence, comes from India's economic story. India attracted the East India Company because of the richness. And before the East India Company came, the plunderers had come from various places. They would plunder and go. Some of them settled here and set up an empire, and the whole empire would be again plundering the country, of course, moving from one corner to the other and trying to win one state over the other and all take the benefits of local kings and their weaknesses. But once the East India Company came and settled here, they realized what is happening in India, and greedily they decided to play their game. And it's not only that the British came and colonized India, there are a few other countries who also came. But British, of course, played the most important, or let me quote it, quote unquoted, the dirty role, and did havoc with India, its education system, its own health, its own health architecture. Well, that's topic for another day. But the economic theory of India's political independence would say that when India had bled enough, when even the bone marrow had been sucked, when resources had been exploited to the maximum, when people had been pushed into poverty, it is then that the British must have thought that the cost of sustaining this country as a colony is now break evening with the revenue that we can suck out of this country. And therefore, if we live a day longer here, the cost will increase than the benefit, and let's just move out. And I'm going to investigate this hypothesis further in the years to come. So, again, there's diversity of thought, and the country tolerates it and accepts it. Given the situation when India took over the presidency, the situation globally was very grim. The grimness of the situation comes from handling of the COVID crisis, the pandemic, where many countries had aggressively pursued policies during COVID, pouring money into the systems without worrying of tomorrow. This, this strategy, this style had started from 2008 with the crash of the Lehman Brothers. Actually, the subprime crisis, which was the cause of the Lehman Brothers, and the asset-backed securities and derivative products, which led to all this, which started around 2000, these were not being properly monitored, supervised, or regulated. So the issue of the economic crisis emanates, takes birth, originates from the financial sector. Because of lack of regulation and supervision, and the philosophy behind it, that the private sector knows it best, and they know what is best for their future, one need not touch them, regulate, or supervise them, or against a hardcore regulation, a soft touch regulation is sufficient. That philosophy was costing dear to the advanced countries which imitate each other, be it North America, be it Europe, or be it England. It would not be wrong to say that the global financial crisis was actually not a global financial crisis. It was a crisis of the advanced countries, and they should be held accountable for that irresponsible behavior in tolerating products which they did not understand and not regulating the derivatives market in time and ensuring they do not engulf the whole financial market in fire, which it eventually did. It is obviously the crisis of the advanced countries because they imitate each other. North America, Europe, and Britain are the factors, the countries, their regulators need to be held accounted for this crisis, which took the world back by more than a decade. And when the world was still very fragile, COVID happened. And on a fragile countries, on a fragile global economy, on a fragile national economies, COVID was the last straw on the camel's back. In contrast, were countries like India, which withstood the pressure that the advanced countries were imposing on them repeatedly. And let me give you a few examples. The first example I would like to share with you is on capital account convertibility. Look at the pressure that was put on India on accepting capital account convertibility repeatedly, repeatedly. Since we undertook the reforms of 1996, 1991, we were under pressure to accept capital account convertibility. We did the first Tarapur Committee report, 96. We did the second Tarapur Committee report, 2007. And with great difficulty, you should read the speeches of the governors at that time saying that capital account convertibility is not for India. We are too vulnerable. We are still very naive and we will be totally overtaken. It will impact our national agendas. It will impact the local economy, local people who are still very vulnerable. And capital account convertibility is not suitable for India. Please look up the speeches of the governors and deputy governors at that time and realize the tremendous pressure put on India. And India, with its wisdom, withstood that pressure and said, we will not go for capital account convertibility. Much later, by 2012, the world recognized that India was correct. And capital account convertibility needs certain strength within the country and the institutions. The second example is on inflation targeting. Inflation targeting became very influential concept, very fashionable, started from a very mundane discussion, not by an economist or a theorist, by a political functionary in New Zealand, and suddenly was adopted by many countries in the world. Multinational institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, especially the IMF, started pushing for implementing inflation targeting in various countries, including India. While most of the countries in the world adopted it, India for a very long time withstood the pressure. Please read the speeches by Dr. Y.V. Reddy, Governor Bimal Jalan, and see how India said that our local minted multiple indicator approach is any day better than your inflation targeting. You will be surprised. The global financial crisis of 2008 has been partially blamed by many economists and scholars that the inflation targeting imposed blinkers on the eyes of the policymakers and political functionaries, and they thought everything is fine. But inflation targeting was just a camouflage. Behind the inflation targeting, inside the economy, many things were happening, and the attention was diverted away from those because the whole world kept thinking of inflation target. Academic studies, scholarly research shows, repeatedly shows, and there's an excellent paper by Lawrence Ball from Johns Hopkins, that the countries which adopted inflation targeting and countries which did not adopt inflation targeting, their performances were rather similar. But inflation targeting imposed hardcore restrictions which impacted growth, and there was a sacrifice ratio. India resisted inflation targeting for a very long time. Very long time. So, take the third case, the derivatives. While the world adopted the derivatives, and they were very sophisticated derivatives, India only introduced slowly, reluctantly, very carefully, conservatively, plain vanilla derivatives. But the Western world ridiculed India that why can't they adopt them? And as I just mentioned in the introduction, we resisted it. And then the whole world knows what happened because of aggressively following the derivatives. So much so, one Nobel laureate and respected one claimed that if India's governor was the chairman and president of Fed Reserve, the global financial crisis, which I say is wrongly worded, it's not global, it is the Western world, it's North American led, it's advanced countries led financial crisis, and through spillovers, the rest of the world got impacted. So they're the ones who should be blamed for it. But the Nobel laureate Stiglitz clearly said if Governor Reddy was the chairman of Fed Reserve, this quote unquote global financial crisis would not have occurred. This is the country that India is. And this is the time when the whole world is shaking and suffering from economic situation which is bad. India assumes the presidency. While India's historical evolution, its history of thousands of years, proves that it can be the richest country on the planet with innovations and inventions which do not hurt the climate. Its philosophy is very germane to sustainable growth pattern, respect for every other element on the planet. India's recent history also is replete and rich with policies, initiatives which are very conducive to overall growth. Let me continue to share one more example with you and then move on to the future. In COVID, as you would have noticed, and I mentioned briefly and I'm going to elaborate now, the fiscal packages provided by various countries ranged substantially higher than India. And those have come home to roost now. India, poor country relatively, with per capita income of hardly $2,000, vis-a-vis America's $60,000. India also provided fiscal support to its citizens, partially quantified, partially not quantified. The support that India provided was in terms of food, free rations, free medical facilities, free vaccination, free hospitalization, and even the private hospitals were invited, rather requested to ensure that nobody goes unattended. So much so that the Prime Minister used his personal image and credibility to request the private sector in the initial stages of the pandemic not to lay off people and support as much as possible, which they did. Unlike the Western world, where as the sales plummeted, as the lockdowns happened, people were just left on the street. And obviously, the government had to come and give them dons and unemployment allowances. But what India did, India very interestingly, though conservative, very intelligently used its limited resources to ensure that people are able to live and survive. While the Food Corporation of India godowns were full of our wheat and rice, they were immediately deployed to provide them across the country. A study by the executive director at the IMF, Surjit Singh Bhalla, with his co-authors Dr. Arvind Virmani and Karan Bhasin, document that support, unlike the rest of the world, where because of pandemic people just fell into poverty, that support by the government held many people above the poverty line. Because when you get unemployment allowances, what would you do? Spend it on food or medicines, and the government took care of both. While Bhala Virmani Bhasin study shows that the food support took care of people who could fall below the poverty line, the quantification of the health support has yet not been attempted by any scholar, and that waits to be done. And once that is done, you will see India's visionary approach amidst limited resources would be a lesson, a case study for the world to follow. And how you take care of your country despite the limited resources. Similarly, the policies that were used at that time were not knee jerk reactions, not aggressive, carefully calibrated, and futuristic in approach. That means while immediate support was being provided in terms of fiscal policy, the capital expenditure kept rising so that the multiplier effect on employment and futuristic growth of the country is not impacted. Fiscal experts have yet to quantify this aspect too, which waits to be done. Similarly, the financial sector, be it the insurance, and the time was used to improve and encourage insurance sector, be it the banking sector, or be it the NBFCs. Each one of them were helped with carefully crafted policies laser beamed on each of these subsectors. As far as employment is concerned, the Mudra schemes that were announced, the insurance schemes and social security measures that were announced, and the schemes for headload workers and cart business people, rediwalas, those were also very carefully crafted and delivered. Those schemes and the impact of those schemes have yet to be assessed by any economist or public policy expert. Once that is done, you will see we will have so much to show to the world that amidst the crisis, one need not be following a knee jerk reaction to please the people. But if you are strong, confident, careful, you can execute policies at very low cost, which are more effective than knee jerk reactions. And why do I keep repeating this word knee jerk reactions? That brings me to the next part of what I want to share with you. Consequent to these policies by the advanced countries, which were neither laser beamed, nor well thought, nor well crafted, resulted in high liquidity into the economies of these countries. While they were still recovering from the derivative products which led them to subprime, while they were still recovering from the heavy unconventional monetary policies that were again pursued aggressively, mindlessly by the advanced countries, without recognizing the spillovers that would happen on many other parts of the world, including emerging countries, including India. The fiscal policy only escalated the liquidity supply in the system. Consequently, when a little aberration of a country invading or fighting with another country happened, Russia versus Ukraine, it precipitated into a huge crisis. The gasoline prices, the petroleum prices shot up. Some commodity prices, agriculture products, fertilizers, some metals in which Russia and Ukraine played a prominent role also shot up. Because of COVID, supply chains were already strained, and now with this conflict, they were further strained. Inflation in these countries was 5 times their average of 30 years. To illustrate, in America, inflation generally is in the range of 2% if you take a 30-year average. So in Europe, so in England. And the inflation in these countries was rising to 10%, 5 times more than national average of last 30 years. Compare it with India. India's national average of 30 years of inflation is around 6%. Our inflation target band, which we adopted around 2014 after lots of reluctance, is in the range of 4 plus minus 2. That means 2 to 6%. 6% is the upper limit. That is where we have been hovering. If you look at the monitorable inflation, which is the CPI combined. Now, because inflation was 5 times their tolerance level or 30-year average, they had to now mindlessly again, knowing that the prices are high because of the conflict, started raising the interest rates. Economic theory is very clear. When you pump in more money, inflation will happen. When you raise the interest rates, growth will suffer. When you pump in more money, liquidity increases, inflation goes up. But when you raise the interest rates, the growth rate for the whole economy is high. The growth rate for the whole economy can suffer. Unemployment is high. And that's exactly what is going to play out, has started playing out for us in the world to see. 2023 will be a year where an artificial recession would have been forced upon the advanced countries by their own central banks, be it Fed Reserve, be it Bank of England, or be it the European Central Bank, ECB. They do what they want to do. But the matter of concern is we are in a globally integrated world. We are one family. We are one earth. We have one future. The spillovers of these advanced countries will hit emerging countries and least developed countries and vulnerable countries, including India, adversely. And this recognition that we are one and your action can impact me is not fully realized. Where is the global accountability? Where is the global responsibility? Nowhere. And that is why when Professor asked me that on Subhash Chandra Bose days, what should be the topic? I said, India's G-20 presidency. A day has come when we have to tell to the world, and this is our honors and our good luck, that we have been given this opportunity to tell to the world that you have to be accountable, you have to be respectful, you have to be responsible for the whole planet. Because we are not saying just because we want to say, but we are saying with 3,000 years of experience. When we provided financial, economic leadership to the world, where from anywhere in the world people wanted to just come and work and look and see India, something which for something the attitude was towards UK, or for some time the attitude is towards America. People wanted to just come to India. We have lived through it, we have experienced it, and we have been extremely responsible. And therefore, when the presidency has come to India, I think we need to showcase to the world you can do a growth model which is sustainable on a long term basis. And we have did it. We have done it in the past, and we can do it, and the whole world needs to ponder over it and do it. What do you mean by sustainable? The term sustainable would mean different things to different people. But should sustainable not be intergenerational? And at any point of time, 3 to 4 generations are alive, the great grandparents, the grandparents, the parents, and the children. But should sustainable not be intergenerational? Which means hundred of years back and hundred of years ahead. And if you want to have a sustainable climate, you want to have a sustainable development, and you believe the planet is one, the earth is one, and our future is interlinked, each one will have to be more responsible and accountable to each one at the present point of time as well as the future point of time. How do you do it? And the last 2 minutes I want to spend before I conclude and thank you is how to do it. And my suggestion is the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the multinational institutions will have to apply their mind, will have to build a consensus, will have to say, now we are in it together. We sail or we sink together. You can be on a Titanic, the most modern ship that has ever been built. But if in one corner of Titanic somebody is doing stupid things, the ship can sink, irrespective that on the other side of the ship you have the most rich, influential policymakers sitting. Does not matter. Once you're sailing in the high seas, you are in the middle of the ocean, you are one. And that's exactly what is happening now. We are either sinking together or we are swimming together. And I think the story of the ship has to be taken seriously, and everybody in the world will have to be accountable for their behavior so that we are able to give to the next generation, next generations, the planet as we had received it. For that, the presidency of G20, given the concept of, as I mentioned, respecting each other, one family concept that India practices, needs to be shared, and hopefully by the end we share the pattern with Brazil in another 8 9 months. The world would be a place which recognizes, understands the concept of one family, and also understands that India can provide intellectual, critical leadership to the planet. And I think that will be the way to celebrate the anniversary of Subhash Chandra Bose. Thank you very much.